The metal floor of the transport ship vibrated beneath Helga Schneider's boots as she pressed her back against the cold hull. Around her, 23 other German women sat in similar positions, knees drawn up, faces pale in the dim light filtering through the ventilation grates. The air smelled of salt, water, diesel fuel, and fear. Helga was 26, a former communications lieutenant who had spent the last 3 years of the war relaying encrypted messages between Wehrmacht units. Now she was prisoner 4,427, stripped of rank, stripped of purpose, stripped of everything except the propaganda films that played endlessly in her mind. She could still hear Goebbels' voice from the last newsreel she'd seen before capture. America is the land of devils who wear the mask of democracy. Their women are brutalized, their society built on exploitation. German prisoners will face unimaginable horrors, backbreaking labor, starvation, torture. They show no mercy to the defeated. Beside her, Annelise Fischer gripped a rosary so tightly her knuckles had gone white. At 31, she was the oldest among them, a nurse who had tended wounded soldiers in field hospitals from Normandy to the Rhine. Her medical training told her the trembling in her hands was a physiological response to sustained stress. But knowing the cause didn't stop the shaking. "What do you think they'll do first?" whispered Greta Hoffman from Helga's other side. At 22, she was the youngest of their small group, a logistics clerk who had been captured during the chaotic final weeks of the war. Her voice cracked on the last word. Helga wanted to offer comfort, but what could she say? Every training session, every propaganda film, every officer's warning had painted the same picture. Capture by the Americans meant degradation, exploitation, possibly death. German women, they'd been told, would be subjected to medical experiments, forced into labor camps worse than anything in the Soviet territories, treated as less than human. "They'll register us first," Annelise said, her nurse's practicality overriding her fear. "Check for disease. Assign barracks. That's standard procedure, even for—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Even for animals," Helga thought, completing the nurse's unspoken words. The ship's engines changed pitch, and someone near the front began to pray aloud in German. Others joined in, their voices creating a desperate chorus that echoed off the metal walls. Helga closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's face, her father's garden, the sound of church bells in her village on Sunday mornings. She tried to remember what it felt like to be human, because she was certain that feeling would soon be taken from her. Hours blurred together in that cramped space. Some women wept openly. Others stared at nothing, shock rendering them nearly catatonic. Helga noticed a young woman across from her, couldn't have been more than 19, rocking back and forth, mumbling the same phrase over and over. "Please God, please God, please God." When the ship finally stopped and the heavy doors groaned open, Helga squinted against the sudden flood of light. American soldiers stood at the opening, rifles slung over their shoulders, but their expressions were neutral. Not cruel, not threatening, just tired, as if they'd done this procedure 100 times before. "All right, ladies, let's move," one of them said in accented but understandable German. "Single file, watch your step. Ladies." Helga's mind caught on the word. Not prisoners, not Nazis, not enemies. Ladies. They were loaded onto military trucks with canvas covers, 20 women to each vehicle. As the convoy began to move, Helga caught her first glimpse of America through the gap in the canvas. Her breath caught in her throat. Texas in late spring of 1945 was nothing like the bombed-out, ash-covered landscapes of Germany. The sky was impossibly blue, unmarred by smoke or aircraft. Fields stretched to the horizon, green and gold in the afternoon. Sunday, she saw cattle grazing peacefully, farmhouses with intact roofs, a child on a bicycle waving at their convoy, as if military trucks were just another part of the landscape. "Where are the ruins?" Greta whispered, voicing what they were all thinking. The propaganda had shown American cities as industrial hellscapes, choking on their own smoke, built on the suffering of the working class. This looked like paradise. The woman next to them, a former radio operator named Ingrid, laughed bitterly. "We were lied to," about everything else. Why not this too? Number. Arrival at the camp. Camp Swift sprawled across the Texas landscape like a small city. As their truck passed through the main gate, Helga counted rows of neat wooden barracks, each painted a clean white with dark green trim. There were gardens, actual gardens between the buildings, with vegetables growing in orderly plots. An American flag snapped in the breeze atop a central pole, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear what sounded like a baseball game in progress. This was a prisoner of war camp. The truck stopped in front of a long, low building marked Processing Center in both English and German. As they climbed down, Helga noticed the ground was graveled and well-maintained, not the muddy morass she'd expected. The air smelled of cut grass and something else, something being baked. She realized with shock. Bread or cookies, carried on the wind from a nearby kitchen. A woman in an American uniform approached their group. She was perhaps 40, with gray threading through her brown hair, and she carried a clipboard with practiced efficiency. Her uniform marked her as a lieutenant colonel, a high rank for a woman, which surprised Helga immediately. "Good afternoon," the officer said in perfect German. "My name is Lieutenant Colonel Margaret Brennan. I'm the administrative officer for this facility. Welcome to Camp Swift. I know you're frightened and exhausted. We're going to make this process as quick and painless as possible. You'll be registered, given a medical examination, assigned quarters, and fed. Any questions?" The German women stared at her in silence. Welcome? Painless? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. No questions? Good. Follow me, please. They were led into the building, which was blessedly cool after the Texas heat. The interior was clean and well lit, with signs posted in both languages. Medical office, quartermaster, registration, everything organized, everything official, everything humane. Helga's group was directed to a row of chairs in a waiting area. An American soldier barely 20 years old, with red hair and freckles, brought them a pitcher of ice water in paper cups. "It's clean," he said in halting German. From faucet? Safe to drink." He smiled awkwardly and retreated. Greta lifted her cup with trembling hands and drank. The water was so cold it hurt her teeth, clean and pure. She drank the entire cup and immediately poured another. "This has to be a trick," Ingrid muttered. "They're fattening us up before whatever comes next." But Annelise, the nurse, was looking around with a more critical eye. "Look at the medical posters," she said quietly, nodding toward the wall. "Nutrition guidelines, disease prevention, proper hygiene protocols. These are current American military standards. If they wanted to harm us, they wouldn't bother with any of this." When Helga's name was called, her heart began racing. This was the moment she'd been dreading most. Goebbels' propaganda had been explicit about what happened to German women during American medical examinations. She'd seen the films, heard the warnings, absorbed the message that her body would be violated, examined like livestock, used for experiments. She forced her legs to carry her into the examination room. The nurse waiting for her was a black woman in her mid-30s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. Helga had never spoken to a black person before. They simply didn't exist in the Germany she knew, and the propaganda had taught her to fear them as much as any enemy. "Hello there," the nurse said in English, then switched to careful German. "My name is Dorothy Patterson. I'm a registered nurse, and I'll be conducting your medical examination today. I need you to know that this is purely for health assessment, checking for infectious diseases, wounds that need treatment, that sort of thing. At no point will you be harmed or made uncomfortable. Do you understand?" Helga nodded, not trusting her voice. "Excellent. Now, I'm going to ask you some questions about your medical history, and then we'll do a basic physical exam. I'll explain everything before I do it, and you can tell me to stop at any time if you need a moment. Sound good?" The examination that followed was professional, thorough, and shockingly gentle. Dorothy explained each step, listening to her lungs, checking her throat, examining her skin for lesions or signs of malnutrition. When she noticed an old scar on Helga's shoulder from shrapnel, she asked about it with genuine concern, not accusation. "Does it still give you pain? Any limited range of motion?" "Sometimes," Helga admitted. When it rains, I'll make a note for the doctor to look at it. We have a physical therapist on staff who might be able to help with that. They were offering medical treatment to prisoners. Helga's worldview continued to crack and splinter. The most shocking moment came near the end of the exam, when Dorothy checked Helga's reflexes and blood pressure. As she unwrapped the blood pressure cuff, she said conversationally, "You know, I was terrified to come work here at first. Why?" The question slipped out before Helga could stop it. "Well, I'd heard all sorts of things about German soldiers, how brutal they were, how they hated people like me. But then I met my first patient, a young man named Klaus, who'd been wounded in France. He was scared out of his mind, thought we were going to torture him. Instead, we set his broken leg and gave him morphine for the pain. And you know what he said?" Dorothy smiled at the memory. "He said, 'Thank you,' in English. Just those 2 words. But it reminded me that soldiers are just people caught up in something bigger than themselves." Helga felt tears burning in her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. "There now," Dorothy said gently, mistaking the tears for pain. "Did I press too hard?" "No," Helga whispered. "No, you've been very kind. That's what we do here, honey. That's just basic human decency." As Helga left the examination room, she passed Annelise in the hallway. The older woman's face was wet with tears, but she was smiling, actually smiling, for the first time since their capture. "They called me ma'am," Annelise whispered in wonder. "The doctor called me ma'am and asked my permission before examining me, like I was a person." The dining hall at Camp Swift could seat 300 people at once. Long tables stretched in neat rows, and the smell of food, real food, hot and plentiful, filled the air with an almost painful intensity. Helga hadn't realized how hungry she was until that moment, how many weeks it had been since she'd had a proper meal. The German women were directed to tables near the back, and American soldiers brought them trays. When Helga saw what was on her tray, she genuinely thought there had been a mistake. A thick piece of pot roast, swimming in rich brown gravy. Mashed potatoes, real potatoes. Not the ersatz mixture she'd eaten for years. Green beans glistening with butter. 2 slices of soft white bread, and on a small plate to the side, a wedge of apple pie with a dollop of cream. "Is this for us?" Greta asked the young soldier who'd brought their trays. He looked confused. "Yeah, it's dinner. Why, is something wrong with it?" "Wrong with it?" Greta's voice cracked. "This is more food than I've seen in months." The soldier's confusion deepened. "This is just regular chow. Nothing special." He paused, then added uncertainly, "I mean, I guess the pie is kind of special. Cook makes it on Thursdays." He leaned in conspiratorially. "Between you and me, it's better when he makes cherry. But don't tell him I said that." As he walked away, Helga stared at her tray. Her hands shook as she picked up her fork. The first bite of pot roast nearly undid her. It was tender, flavorful, abundantly seasoned. Real meat. Not the mystery protein that had become standard in the Wehrmacht mess halls. She chewed slowly, trying to make it last, trying to understand how this meal, which the American soldier had dismissed as nothing special, could exist in a world where Germany had been starving for years. Around the table, her companions were having similar reactions. One woman was crying openly as she ate. Another had her head bowed in prayer, whispering thanks to God between bites. Annelise ate methodically, but Helga could see the tremor in her hands, the disbelief in her eyes. It was Greta who voiced what they were all thinking. "Everything they told us was a lie," she said quietly. Every single thing. At a nearby table, a group of American soldiers were eating the same meal, chatting and laughing among themselves. One of them complained loudly, "Man, I was hoping for fried chicken today. Thursday pot roast is getting old." His companion punched his shoulder good-naturedly. "Stop whining, Thompson. At least we're not eating K-rations in a foxhole anymore." Yeah. Still, I miss Mama's cooking. She does pot roast way better than this." Helga caught Greta's eye. The younger woman had gone pale, and Helga knew why. These American soldiers were casually complaining about a meal that would have been considered a feast in wartime Germany. They took it for granted, this abundance, this variety, this quality. It wasn't propaganda or a special show put on for prisoners. This was just their normal, everyday experience. The propaganda films had shown Americans as suffering under capitalism, as downtrodden and exploited, barely surviving in their industrial wasteland. But these men looked healthy, well-fed, and most shocking of all, genuinely happy. They joked and laughed with an ease that Helga hadn't seen in German soldiers for years, maybe ever. When an American officer walked by their table, Annelise gathered her courage and spoke in careful English. "Excuse me, sir?" The officer stopped, a middle-aged man with captain's bars. "Yes? Ma'am?" There was that word again, ma'am, spoken to an enemy prisoner as if she deserved respect. "This food," Annelise continued haltingly. "It is standard? Not special?" The captain looked puzzled. "Standard? Well, yeah. Geneva Convention requires us to feed prisoners the same rations as our own troops. Why? Is there a problem? Are you allergic to something?" "No. No problem. Thank you, sir." As he walked away, Annelise turned to the others. "Did you hear that? The same rations as their own troops. They're not starving us. They're not even giving us inferior food. We're eating exactly what they eat." That night, as Helga lay in her assigned bunk in a clean, heated barracks with real mattresses and blankets, she couldn't sleep. Every preconception, every belief, every piece of propaganda she'd absorbed over the past 6 years was crumbling. And in its place, a terrible question was forming. If they lied about this, what else did they lie about? What else have we believed that isn't true? Helga woke to sunlight streaming through clean windows and the sound of birds singing. For a moment, she forgot where she was. And then, reality crashed back. She was a prisoner of war in an American camp in Texas, and she had no idea what this day would bring. The wake-up call came at 0600 hours, but it wasn't the harsh bugle or shouted commands she'd expected. Instead, a female American sergeant walked through the barracks ringing a handbell and calling out cheerfully, "Good morning, ladies. Breakfast is at 0630. Showers are available now if you need them." Showers. Real showers, with hot water and soap. Greta had tested them the night before and reported back in amazement that the water pressure was good and there was actual shampoo available, not the harsh lye soap they'd been using in Germany. After breakfast, oatmeal with brown sugar, toast with jam, fresh milk, and coffee so rich it made Helga's eyes water. The women were assembled in the recreation yard. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan stood before them with an interpreter, though many of the women had enough English to follow along. "Ladies," she began, "I'm going to explain how this camp operates. First and foremost, you are prisoners of war, which means you are protected under the Geneva Convention. You have rights, and those rights will be respected at all times. You will not be tortured, you will not be starved, and you will not be forced into labor that is unsafe or degrading." She paused to let the interpreter catch up, then continued. "However, according to the Geneva Convention, prisoners may be assigned work duties appropriate to their rank and physical condition. These duties include maintenance of the camp, laundry services, kitchen work, and agricultural labor. All work is voluntary." "Voluntary?" Someone interrupted in German. "You mean we can refuse?" The interpreter translated, and Colonel Brennan nodded. "Yes, though I should note that prisoners who work receive additional privileges, including a small stipend that can be used at the camp store, but no one will be punished for refusing work." This seemed incomprehensible. Work was voluntary? They could say no? "In addition to work opportunities," Brennan continued, "we have various programs available to you. We have a library with books in German, English language classes for those interested, religious services on Sundays, and recreational activities including volleyball, gardening, and arts and crafts. There's also a theater group that puts on plays once a month." Helga exchanged glances with Annelise. "Plays? Arts and crafts? This was a prison camp? You're also permitted to write letters home." though all mail will be reviewed by censors for security purposes. You may receive packages from family members, and you're encouraged to maintain contact with your loved ones. After the assembly, the women were given tours of the camp facilities. Helga's group was led by an American corporal named Robert Hayes, a tall, sandy-haired man from Kansas who spoke surprisingly good German. "Learned it from my grandmother," he explained as he walked them through the camp. "She emigrated in 1903. Used to tell me stories about the old country." He showed them the library first, a well-stocked room with hundreds of books lining the shelves. Helga recognized German classics Goethe, Schiller, Mann alongside American and British literature in translation. There was even a small section of newspapers, though they were several weeks old. "The newspapers are mainly for English practice," Hayes explained. "But you can read about how the war ended, what's happening in Europe now." Some ladies find it helpful to understand the bigger picture. Next was the chapel, a simple wooden building with Christian crosses and Jewish stars displayed side by side. "We have a Catholic priest who comes on Sundays, a Lutheran minister on alternating weeks, and a rabbi once a month," Hayes said. "All prisoners are welcome to attend whatever service they choose, or none at all. Your choice." The recreational yard was their next stop. Several women were already there, some tending a vegetable garden, others playing volleyball. An American soldier sat under a tree, reading a book and occasionally glancing up to supervise. But he seemed utterly unconcerned about the prisoners' activities. "The garden was their idea," Hayes said, nodding toward the vegetable plot. "Last summer's crop yielded enough tomatoes and peppers to supplement the kitchen supplies for 2 months. The ladies were pretty proud of that." Greta stared at the garden with something like longing. "We can really just plant things and tend them?" "Sure, if you want to." Some of the ladies find it therapeutic. Good, honest work, you know? Makes the time pass easier. The last stop on the tour was the mess hall kitchen, where several German prisoners were already at work under the supervision of American cooks. The head cook, a cheerful man named Sergeant Louis Martinez, greeted them warmly. "Always happy to have more help," he said through the interpreter. "Anyone here with cooking experience?" Annelise raised her hand hesitantly. "I worked in a hospital kitchen before I became a nurse." "Excellent. We can always use people who know their way around a proper kitchen. Come back tomorrow if you're interested, and I'll show you the ropes." As they left the kitchen, Helga felt dizzy with the cognitive dissonance of it all. This wasn't imprisonment, not as she understood it. What was this? It was structured, certainly, and they weren't free to leave. But the casual respect, the opportunities for meaningful activity, the assumption that they were human beings deserving of dignity, none of this matched anything she'd been taught about American prison camps. That afternoon, she saw something that crystallized everything. A group of American soldiers were playing baseball in a field, adjacent to the prisoners' recreation yard. The game looked informal. Just men playing for fun during their off-duty time. One of them hit the ball hard, and it sailed over the fence into the prisoner's yard, landing near where Greta was sitting. Greta picked up the ball, and for a moment, Helga held her breath. What would happen now? Would the guards yell? Would Greta be punished for touching American property? Instead, one of the soldiers jogged over to the fence. "Hey, could you toss that back?" he called in English, making throwing motions with his hands. Greta threw the ball back over the fence. The soldier caught it, grinned, and called out, "Thanks, nice arm." That was it. No suspicion, no hostility. Just a casual interaction between people. The soldier trotted back to his game, and Greta sat down slowly, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "They don't hate us," she whispered. "They don't even seem to care that we're German." Annelise, who had witnessed the exchange, nodded slowly. "Maybe they just see us as people who happen to be on the wrong side of a war. Maybe that's all we ever were to them." 3 weeks into their captivity, something unexpected happened. Local farmers began arriving at the camp, looking to hire German POWs for seasonal agricultural work. This was apparently common practice. The men's camps had been providing labor for Texas farms since 1943, And now that harvest season was approaching, the farmers were willing to hire women prisoners as well. Helga, Annelise, and Greta volunteered together, partly out of curiosity and partly out of a desperate need to do something productive. The boredom of camp life, despite all its unexpected comforts, was beginning to wear on them. The farmer who selected them was a weathered man in his 60s named Tom Fletcher. He owned a substantial cotton and vegetable operation about 15 miles from the camp, and he needed help with the harvest. An American guard, a quiet corporal named Daniel Morris, would accompany them and stay for the duration of the work. The drive to the Fletcher farm gave Helga her first real look at rural Texas. The land rolled gently, marked by occasional groves of oak trees and endless fields of cotton, corn, and sorghum. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures, and farmhouses sat at the ends of long driveways, their mailboxes lined up along the country road like sentinels. "Pretty, isn't it?" Corporal Morris said, catching Helga's gaze. "Different from Europe, I'd imagine." "Very different," Helga admitted. "So much space. So much untouched land. That's Texas for you. Bigger than Germany, did you know that? And only about 6 million people living here. Lots of room to spread out." The Fletcher farm was a sprawling operation with a main house, several outbuildings, and what looked like workers' quarters. As they pulled up, a woman in her 50s emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. This was Tom's wife, Caroline Fletcher, and she greeted them with the same puzzling kindness they'd encountered everywhere else. "Welcome. Welcome," she said warmly. "I've got cold lemonade waiting, and we'll get you set up with sun hats before you start. Texas heat is no joke, especially if you're not used to it." The work itself was hard picking vegetables in the hot sun, loading crates onto trucks, sorting produce by size and quality. But it was honest work, physical and straightforward. And Helga found it oddly satisfying. Her body ached in a clean, tired way that felt healthy after weeks of relative inactivity. During their lunch break, taken under the shade of a massive oak tree, Caroline brought them sandwiches, fruit, and more lemonade. She sat down with them, apparently comfortable sharing a meal with enemy prisoners. "My son was in the war," she said conversationally, not seeming to notice how the 3 German women stiffened. "Infantry, saw action in France and Belgium. He wrote us letters about what he saw over there, the destruction, the refugees, the soldiers on both sides, just trying to survive." She paused, taking a sip of her lemonade. "He told me something that stuck with me. He said most of the German soldiers he encountered were just scared boys. No different from American boys except for the uniform they wore. He said war turns everyone into something they're not, makes them do things they'd never do in normal life. None of the German women knew how to respond to this. Anyway," Caroline continued, "my point is that I don't hold any grudge against you girls. You were caught up in something terrible, same as everyone else, and now you're here, and you're working hard, and that's all that matters to me." It was Greta who broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you fight for Hitler?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Helga realized it was the same question she'd been asking herself since they arrived, the question that had haunted her dreams. "I don't know," Helga said finally. "I believed. We believed we were fighting for Germany, for our families, for our future. We believed what we were told, that Germany was threatened, that we had to defend ourselves, that our enemies were." She couldn't finish. "Evil?" Caroline supplied gently. "Monsters? Bent on destroying everything you loved?" Helga nodded miserably. "That's what propaganda does," Caroline said. "It takes your natural love for your country, your natural fear of losing what's precious to you, and it twists those feelings into something dark. It makes you see enemies where there are just people, threats where there are just differences." Annelise spoke up, her voice thick with unshed tears. "But we should have known better. We should have questioned. Should have what?" Caroline interrupted, not unkindly. "Should have risked your life and your family's lives by speaking out against a totalitarian regime. Should have seen through propaganda that was designed by experts to be believable. Should have been superhuman instead of just human." She shook her head. "No, dear. You were victims too. just in a different way. The real evil was the men who started this war, who fed you those lies, who put you in positions where you had to choose between believing what you were told or risking everything to resist. They worked in silence for the rest of the afternoon, each lost in her own thoughts. But something had shifted. Some burden had been acknowledged, if not entirely lifted. As they prepared to return to camp, Tom Fletcher approached them with a wooden crate full of fresh tomatoes, squash, and corn. "For you girls," he said. "Take it back to camp. Share it with the others. You earned it today." Corporal Morris started to object. There were probably regulations about gifts to prisoners, but Tom held up a hand. "These ladies worked hard in my fields today, in 100-degree heat. And they did good work. Where I come from, you pay people fairly for their labor. This is part of their pay." As they drove back to camp, the crate of vegetables secure in the truck bed, Greta said something that surprised all of them. "I want to come back. I want to work on the farm again." "Why?" Annelise asked. "Because Mrs. Fletcher talked to us like people. Because the work felt meaningful. Because..." She paused, searching for words. "Because it felt like the first honest thing I've done in years. No lies, no propaganda, no pretending. Just work and sweat and vegetables growing in the ground." Helga understood exactly what she meant. The package arrived on a Tuesday in July, addressed to the German ladies at Camp Swift with no specific recipient named. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan brought it to the Women's Recreation Hour, her expression softer than usual. "This came from a local family," she explained. "The Washingtons. They heard we had German women here and wanted to send something." She placed the box on a table, and the women gathered around it with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. What could an American family possibly want to send to enemy prisoners? Inside were homemade cookies wrapped in wax paper, several jars of preserves, a few magazines, and a letter. Helga's English had improved enough to read it aloud, translating as she went. "Dear German ladies, my name is Martha Washington, and my husband James and I live about 20 miles from your camp. We heard that you were there, and we wanted to reach out to you with a message of peace and Christian charity. Our son, Robert Washington, was a soldier in the United States Army. He fought in the Pacific Theater and was killed on Okinawa in April of this year. He was 23 years old, and he was the light of our lives. We are writing to you not to blame you for his death. He wasn't fighting Germans, and even if he had been, we know that soldiers don't choose their wars. We're writing to you because we know what it's like to have someone you love far from home, in danger, uncertain of the future. We know what it's like to pray every night for their safety and to wake every morning wondering if this will be the day you get terrible news. We imagine that you have people who love you, people who are praying for you, the same way we prayed for Robert. And we want you to know that we're praying for you too. We're praying that you'll be treated well, that you'll stay healthy and safe, and that someday you'll be reunited with your families. The war is over now, but the healing will take much longer. We believe that healing starts with seeing each other as human beings, as children of God, rather than as enemies. You are not our enemies. You are young women caught up in a terrible conflict, just as our son was. Please accept these small gifts as a token of our goodwill. The cookies are Robert's favorite recipe, oatmeal raisin, his grandmother's specialty. The preserves are from our garden, put up last summer. The magazines are just for entertainment, but we hope they help pass the time. May God bless you and keep you safe. Martha and James Washington." By the time Helga finished reading, she was crying. Around her, every woman in the room was in tears. Annelise had her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Greta sat perfectly still, tears streaming down her face, staring at the box of cookies as if it contained something sacred. "They lost their son," Annelise finally choked out. "They lost their son in the war, and they're sending us cookies and praying for us. How can they possibly?" "Forgiveness," said an older German woman named Elizabeth, who had been captured in France. "This is what forgiveness looks like." Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, who had been standing quietly to the side, stepped forward. "Ladies, I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to understand something important. The Washingtons aren't unusual. There are many Americans who feel this way, who see you as people, not as enemies, who want reconciliation instead of revenge. She paused, letting her words sink in. The war is over. Germany has surrendered. But the question now is, what kind of peace will we build? Will it be a peace built on hatred and punishment, or one built on understanding and reconstruction? People like the Washingtons are choosing the latter, and they're doing it even when it's painful, even when they have every right to feel anger and resentment. That evening, the women held an impromptu meeting in their barracks. Someone suggested they write a response to the Washingtons, and the idea quickly gained support. But what could they say? How could they possibly respond to such grace? It was Annelise, practical as always, who found the words. We thank them. We tell them about ourselves. Help them see us as real people. And we tell them we're sorry not for being German, but for the pain this war has caused, for the loss they've suffered, for all the broken hearts on every side. They worked on the letter together over several days, drafting and redrafting, trying to find the right tone. The final version was simple and honest. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Washington, we received your package and your letter, and we hardly know how to respond. Your generosity and kindness have touched us more deeply than we can express, especially knowing the terrible loss you have suffered. We are not monsters, though we know our country did monstrous things. We are daughters, sisters, friends. We loved our families and our homeland, and we believed we were doing the right thing by serving our country. We were wrong about so many things. The propaganda we believed, the cause we served, the vision of the world we were taught, so much of it was lies. Being here in Texas, seeing how we're treated, meeting people like you, it has forced us to confront truths we had been taught to deny. We are learning what real humanity looks like, what real civilization means. And we are deeply ashamed of what our nation became. We cannot bring back your son, Robert, and we cannot undo the suffering this war has caused. But we can promise you this. We will remember your kindness for the rest of our lives. We will tell others about it, and we will try, in whatever small ways we can, to build the kind of world where such kindness is common rather than extraordinary. The cookies were delicious. Several of us cried while eating them, thinking about Robert and his grandmother, thinking about all the boys and girls who will never come home, thinking about all the ordinary happiness that war destroys. Thank you for seeing us as human beings. Thank you for your prayers. And please know that we are praying for you too, praying that your pain will ease, that you will find peace, and that Robert's sacrifice will ultimately contribute to a better world. With deepest gratitude and respect, the German women of Camp Swift. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan personally delivered the letter to the Washington family, and a few weeks later, another package arrived. This one contained a photograph of Robert Washington in his uniform, smiling at the camera with the easy confidence of youth. On the back, Martha Washington had written, "So you can know who you're praying for." The photograph was posted in the women's barracks, and it became a kind of shrine. Women would pause in front of it, studying the young man's face, wondering what he had been like, what dreams he'd had, what kind of man he might have become if he'd lived. They prayed for him, this American soldier they'd never met. And through him they prayed for all the dead German and American, soldier and civilian, the guilty and the innocent alike. As summer turned to fall, news from Europe painted an increasingly grim picture. Berlin had fallen to the Soviets. Hitler was dead, probably by suicide. The Nazi government had collapsed completely. Germany itself was divided into occupation zones, and the full extent of the Nazi regime's crimes was being revealed to the world. Camp Swift had a radio in the recreation hall, and the German women were allowed to listen to news broadcasts. At first, they'd been grateful for this connection to home, but as the reports came in, that gratitude curdled into horror. The concentration camps, the systematic murder of millions of Jews, Roma, disabled people, political dissidents, and others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The medical experiments, the gas chambers, the mass graves, the industrial machinery of death. It's propaganda, some women insisted at first. American lies to justify the war. to make us look worse than we were, but the evidence was overwhelming. Photographs, testimony from survivors, confessions from captured SS officers, details too specific, too corroborated, too consistent to be fabricated. Helga spent 3 days in her bunk, unable to eat, barely able to breathe. She had served the regime that did these things. She had encrypted messages for the Wehrmacht that helped coordinate military operations that protected these camps. She had worn the uniform, taken the oath, believed the cause. "I didn't know," she kept saying. "I didn't know." Annelise, who had been crying since the first reports emerged, sat beside her. "Does that matter? Should we have known? Shouldn't we have questioned more? Looked harder? Demanded answers? They would have killed us," Greta said flatly. "Anyone who questioned, anyone who resisted, they disappeared. You know this, Annelise. You worked in hospitals. You saw what happened to people who spoke out. So we chose to be blind," Annelise said bitterly. "We chose comfort and safety over truth. We chose to believe pleasant lies rather than face terrible realities." Lieutenant Colonel Brennan called a meeting of all the German prisoners, both the women's camp and the adjacent men's camp. Over 400 German POWs gathered in the camp's main assembly hall, and Brennan stood before them with a grim expression. "By now, you've all heard the reports from Europe," she said without preamble. "You know what's been discovered. I want to show you something, because I believe you need to see it with your own eyes, not just hear it described." She had arranged a screening of documentary footage from the liberation of the camps. The images were grainy, black and white, but devastatingly clear. Skeletal prisoners, mountains of corpses, children with hollow eyes, the machinery of mass murder, documented in excruciating detail. Many prisoners fled the hall before the film ended. Others vomited. Some sat in stunned silence, staring at the screen as if hypnotized. Helga watched it all, forcing herself not to look away, forcing herself to bear witness to what her country had become. When the lights came back on, Brennan spoke again. Her voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not showing you this to punish you or to make you feel guilty for things you personally didn't do. I'm showing you this because you need to understand what you were part of, what your country became. Some of you served this regime willingly. Some of you had no choice. Some of you genuinely didn't know this was happening. But all of you need to reckon with this truth." She paused, letting her words settle. "Here's what I want you to understand. This isn't about collective guilt. You are not personally responsible for the Holocaust unless you personally participated in it. But you do have a responsibility going forward. You have a responsibility to remember, to bear witness, to tell the truth about what happened, especially when it's painful and shameful." That night, the barracks were eerily quiet. Women lay in their bunks, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with thoughts too large and terrible to voice. Some prayed. Some wept. Some just lay in numb silence. Helga thought about her childhood in Bavaria, about the parades and rallies she'd attended, about the excitement she'd felt as a teenager watching the German army march. She'd believed in something grand and glorious, a vision of German greatness and renewal. But what had it actually been? What had she actually served? "We have to live with this," she said aloud, surprising herself. "For the rest of our lives, we have to live with knowing what we were part of." "How?" Greta asked from her bunk. "How do we live with this?" "By not forgetting," Annelise answered. "By telling the truth, even when it hurts. By making sure it never happens again. And by being better," added a voice from across the room. It was Elizabeth, the older woman. "By choosing, every day for the rest of our lives, to be the kind of people who would never let this happen. By building instead of destroying. By including instead of excluding. By questioning authority instead of blindly following." In the darkness, women began to whisper agreement. It wasn't much, just a small group of former enemy soldiers making quiet promises to themselves and each other. But it was something. A starting point for rebuilding not just a country but their own souls. In late autumn of 1945, Lieutenant Colonel Brennan called another assembly. This time, her message was different. Ladies, the war has been over for 6 months now. Arrangements are being made for repatriation, sending you back to Germany. However, there's another option available to you. She explained that the United States was facing a labor shortage due to the war, and American businesses were authorized to sponsor former POWs who wanted to remain in the country for a limited period. The arrangements would be temporary at first 1 or 2 year work visas, but could potentially lead to permanent residency if both the worker and the employer were satisfied. This is entirely voluntary, Brennan emphasized. No one will think less of you for choosing to go home. Many of you have families waiting for you, and I understand the pull of returning to your homeland, even in its current condition. But for those who might want to stay, at least temporarily, I wanted you to know the option exists. That night, Helga, Annelise, and Greta sat in their usual spot in the recreation yard, watching the Texas sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "What are we going to do?" Greta asked. Helga thought about Germany as she'd last seen it: bombed cities, starving civilians, Soviet soldiers on the streets. She thought about her mother, who would be waiting for news of her survival. She thought about her hometown, which had been occupied by American forces. "I have to go back," she said slowly. "My mother is elderly and alone. She needs me." But she paused, struggling to articulate the conflict tearing at her heart. "But I don't know how I'll bear it. Going back to that place, that country that became something so horrible, living among people who either participated in or turned a blind eye to genocide. How do I look my neighbors in the eye, knowing what we collectively allowed to happen?" "You do it by being part of the rebuilding," Annelise said. "By telling the truth about what you learned here, about how Americans treated us, by showing people that there's another way to live, another way to treat each other." Greta shook her head. "I'm not going back. I can't. There's nothing left for me there. My parents are dead. My brothers are missing. My city is rubble. But here," she gestured around them, "here I've found something I never had in Germany. Respect, dignity, the freedom to be myself, without fear. I want to stay." "What will you do?" Helga asked. "The Fletchers have offered to sponsor me. Caroline says they need help on the farm year-round, and she's willing to teach me American farming methods. It's honest work, and they're good people. I think I could build a life here." Annelise had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now she spoke up. "I'm staying too. The camp hospital has offered me a position as a nurse's aide. They say if I complete additional training, I could eventually become a registered nurse under American standards. I want to do that. I want to use my skills to help people, to make up in some small way for—" Her voice broke. "For all the harm our country did." Over the following weeks, the women made their individual choices. About 40% decided to stay in America, at least temporarily. The others prepared for repatriation, packing their few belongings and saying goodbye to the friends they'd made. On the day of the first departures, Helga stood with Greta and Annelise on the parade ground, watching the buses load. Women she'd lived with for months, whose stories she knew, whose tears she'd shared, were leaving for a Germany she could barely imagine now. "Write to us," Annelise said, hugging Helga fiercely. "Tell us what it's like there, how the rebuilding goes, and tell people what you saw here. Tell them Americans aren't monsters, that ordinary people can choose kindness even toward their enemies." "I will," Helga promised. "And you write to me. Tell me about your new lives, your new country. Help me understand that good things can come from terrible things, that healing is possible." As the bus carrying Helga pulled away from Camp Swift, she pressed her face to the window, watching America disappear behind her. She thought about the meals she'd eaten, the books she'd read, the work she'd done, the Americans she'd met. She thought about Martha Washington's letter and Robert's photograph. She thought about Dorothy Patterson calling her honey while taking her blood pressure. She thought about Caroline Fletcher sitting under an oak tree, talking about propaganda and forgiveness. She thought about everything she'd believed and how wrong she'd been. And she thought about the responsibility she now carried to tell the truth, to bear witness, to help build a better Germany from the ruins of the old. It would be hard. It would probably be the hardest thing she'd ever done. But she'd learned something crucial during her time as a prisoner in Texas. Being human means choosing kindness even when it's difficult, means extending dignity even to those who might not deserve it, means building bridges instead of walls. If Americans could do that for their defeated enemies, then surely Germans could do it for themselves and each other as they rebuilt their shattered nation. Number 20 years later. The weight of truth. In 1965, Helga Schneider sat in her small apartment in Munich, surrounded by photographs and letters, writing the final pages of her memoir. She was 46 now, her hair streaked with gray, her hands marked by 2 decades of honest work rebuilding Germany. Her mother had passed away 3 years earlier, finally at peace after the suffering of the post-war years. The book had taken her 5 years to write. She'd titled it The Camp That Saved My Soul, and she knew it would be controversial. Some would accuse her of being too sympathetic to the Americans, of betraying her country by praising the enemy. Others would say she was excusing German crimes by highlighting her own suffering. But she'd learned in Texas that truth mattered more than comfort. And this was her truth. She wrote about the propaganda films she'd believed, the lies she'd internalized, the shock of discovering how wrong she'd been. She wrote about pot roast and apple pie, about Dorothy Patterson's gentle hands, about Martha Washington's impossible forgiveness. She wrote about the moment she'd understood that everything she'd believed about America and Americans had been a carefully constructed fabrication designed to make her hate and fear. Most importantly, she wrote about what she'd learned regarding propaganda and how it works. They didn't convince us Americans were evil by showing us complex truths, she wrote. They convinced us by showing us simplified lies, repeated endlessly, until we couldn't imagine any other reality. They exploited our love of country, our fear of loss, our desire to believe we were on the right side. And they did it so skillfully that even intelligent, educated people like myself accepted it without question. The book ended with a simple plea. Question everything your government tells you about your enemies. Question especially those things that make you feel righteous in your hatred, superior in your suffering, justified in your violence. Because I have learned this truth through painful experience, those who want to lead us into war will always begin by lying about those we're meant to fight. When The Camp That Saved My Soul was published in 1966, it became an unexpected bestseller in West Germany. Young Germans, wrestling with their parents' generation's complicity in the Nazi regime, found in it a story of redemption and learning. Older Germans, many of whom had their own stories of disillusionment with the propaganda they'd believed, recognized their own journey in Helga's words. The book eventually made its way to America, where it was translated and published in 1968. Helga received letters from American veterans who'd guarded POW camps, from civilians who'd known German prisoners, from people who'd been moved by her story of transformation. One letter came from Martha Washington. She was elderly now, her handwriting shaky, but her message was clear. Thank you for telling the truth. Thank you for showing that Robert's sacrifice, and the sacrifices of so many others, were not in vain. Thank you for proving that ordinary human decency is stronger than propaganda, that kindness is more powerful than hate. Your story gives me hope that Robert's death contributed to a better world, even in this small way. Helga kept that letter on her desk for the rest of her life. Annelise Brennan, she'd married an American soldier and taken his name, had become a respected nurse in Houston, known for her work with refugee patients. She specialized in helping people who'd experienced trauma, drawing on her own experiences to provide care that was both medically sound and deeply compassionate. She'd written to Helga regularly over the years, and when the book was published, she sent a telegram that simply said, "You did it. You told them the truth. I'm proud of you." Greta Fletcher still lived on the farm in Texas. She and Caroline had become as close as mother and daughter. And when the older woman's health declined, Greta had taken over much of the farm's management. She'd never married, but she'd built a life of quiet satisfaction, growing things in the Texas soil, feeding people, contributing to her adopted community. Her copy of Helga's book sat on her nightstand, dog-eared and well-read, marked with notes in the margins. In the book's epilogue, Helga reflected on what her experience had taught her about humanity and history. We are all capable of being deceived. We are all vulnerable to propaganda that plays on our fears and our loyalties. But we are also capable of learning, of changing, of recognizing our mistakes, and choosing to do better. The Americans who treated us with such unexpected kindness weren't perfect people. They had their own prejudices, their own flaws, their own capacity for cruelty. But they chose to see us as human beings first, and enemies second, and that choice made all the difference. I cannot undo my service to a regime that committed genocide. I cannot bring back the millions who died because people like me believed and obeyed. But I can tell the truth about what propaganda does to the human mind, and I can bear witness to the power of simple human decency to break through even the most sophisticated lies. This is my offering to the future. The story of how kindness changed my life, how truth shattered my illusions, and how ordinary people on both sides of a terrible war managed to find their way back to their shared humanity. May we never forget how easily we can be made to hate, and may we never stop choosing to love anyway. The book closed with a photograph. It showed 3 young women in a Texas cotton field, circa 1945, squinting into the sunlight and smiling tentatively at the camera. Helga, Annelise, and Greta, captured in a moment of peace they'd never expected to find, in a country they'd been taught to fear, surrounded by people they'd been told were monsters. The caption read simply, "The truth will set you free, but first it will break your heart."